Alrighty. So as Rachel said, and as the slide here would indicate, we're going to talk about analysis services today. So as you guys saw there in the poll, a very small number of you guys are actually using Tabular. The majority of you that are using analysis services, probably about 90% of the people using analysis services or more, we're actually using the multidimensional. So that's right about, kind of about where I figured it would be. I was thinking probably like 80 to 85% would be on multidimensional, since Tabular has started to get a little bit more popular over the last year or so. But that's pretty much to be expected since Tabular is very new. I was a little bit surprised though to see how many of you guys are actually not using analysis services at all. And that was I think it was a little over, or right around 50% of you said that you're currently not using analysis services at all. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to take a look at both versions of analysis services and hopefully give you guys a little bit, get you guys started with that, and hopefully you'll be able to at least go back and build a small cube or a small tabular model and get yourself going on that, kind of to start exploring some of the options that you have there. You see there on the screen my contact information. Of course, my name is Bradley. I work for Pragmatic Works. There's my email if you guys have any questions. If you do have any questions throughout the session, though, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and I will do a follow-up blog here in the next day or so, where I will give you a link to the recording for this, as all of our sessions are recorded, as well as answer any questions that I don't get to during the session today. Okay? So just to kind of level set expectations here, again, we're going to talk about both tabular and multidimensional. We're going to build a model in each one of those, but we're not going to go into too deep of detail just because we don't really have the time to go into that. If you guys are interested, though, in which one of these two models will better suit your needs, we'll talk very briefly about that. But we actually have a webinar that Devin Knight and Dustin Ryan did for us about 2 weeks ago, I think. And they talked, for the entire hour, they talked about the advantages and disadvantages, or the advantages and limitations of each of the two types of analysis services. So if you are more curious into which one of these is going to better fit your needs, that would be a great webinar to watch. And when I do my follow-up blog, I'll actually put a link to that webinar in there as well for you. Alrighty, so a little bit about myself here real quick. I'm a consultant and trainer at Pragmatic Works. I blog on my, my website there that you saw, as well as bidn.com and SQLServerCentral.com. I work on a couple of books here and there, and I do a lot of speaking events. I actually just got done last night procrastinating long enough to submit my sessions for Summit right before the deadline. And there on the right-hand side, that's how all my blogs get written, by a kitten walking across the keyboard and typing. So they're very quality. All right, so let's talk a little bit here about multidimensional versus tabular before we actually go and we build a couple of these models. So with SQL Server 2012, so I'll give you guys a little bit of background here before we go too much further. With SQL Server 2012, they introduced that right column, that tabular model. Prior to 2012, the only option that we had was the multidimensional. So there's quite a few differences between the two of these two different types of analysis services. Ultimately, though, you connect to them using, more often than not, you're going to connect to them using Excel, and your users are going to browse the data with a pivot table. So I'll show you guys how to do that here as well with both of those models, and you'll see it's actually the exact same process. There are some differences as to how the engines are set up in the background and about how you query those. So your query language and your expression language and everything with multidimensional is going to be MDX. Over on the tabular side, it's going to be something called DAX. Okay, so there are some differences between the two. And again, if you're using SQL Server 2008 R2 or previous, the only one of these options you're going to have is multidimensional. So with 2012 and beyond, you also have the option for tabular. So if any of you guys out there have ever used Power Pivot, you have essentially already gotten a look at tabular. Tabular and Power Pivot are very, very similar. The vast majority of the functionality that you have in Tabular is actually available right inside of Power Pivot. Tabular obviously is going to scale better than Power Pivot because it's not contained inside of your Excel application, so it's going to have better scalability than Power Pivot. But ultimately, they're essentially the same engine in the background. Okay, so these again are just a few of the points to take a look at whenever you get ready to build your analysis services model. So some of the things we need to take into account are how much scalability we need, how much time does it take to develop my solution, what kind of business logic is going to go into my analysis services layer, and what's the learning curve to get up to speed on this. So you can see there where kind of the winners are between these two tools. Multidimensional is definitely going to scale long term with very large data sets. It's going to scale better than Tabular. Tabular is much more memory intensive because it's an in-memory version of analysis services. So if you need massive scalability, you're probably going to need to go with multidimensional. For instance, if you need to build a very, very large cube like somebody like Yahoo has, I think they still currently have the largest production analysis services cube in the world. If you need to have something that scales very large into the many terabytes and into petabytes even, you're going to have to go with multidimensional more than likely to get the performance that you need out of it, as opposed to going with Tabular because of the memory usage with the engine. Development time, though, what you'll see here today whenever we go through a couple of examples, the development time is actually much, much quicker with Tabular. So you'll see that all we really have to do in Tabular is go in, import a couple of tables, and we're ready to go. There's a lot more back-end work that you have to do on the multidimensional side. So if you just need a quick interim solution for users to be able to go out there and build with, and then maybe you want to explore some options down the road a little bit deeper into multidimensional versus Tabular, just get something out there for your users, Tabular is definitely the way to go. Conversely, we have complex business problems. So those are going to be things like many-to-many relationships. Tabular just doesn't handle them as well as multidimensional does. So complex business situations, you're probably going to be going with multidimensional. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the learning curve. So Tabular is definitely the easier tool. It's much more like an Excel interface, and if you've ever used Power Pivot, you pretty much already know most of Tabular already. Okay. So let's take a look at a couple of features here, and then we'll get into a little bit of development stuff here. So what you'll notice here is that there actually is a pretty good overlap between some of the features in multidimensional and some of the features with Tabular. In both tools, we can go in and we can create calculated measures. So what we mean by that is something like profit, for instance. If I want to go in and I want to define profit as potentially something like sales minus cost, I can go into either one of these tools and very easily create that calculation. Same thing with drill through. If I want to do drill through, so if I go into Excel and I just double click on a cell, it'll actually give me the details behind that cell. Both tools do that. The reason why I have a little bit smaller X over there under the Tabular side is because you can do drill through, but you don't get as much control over the drill through as you do with multidimensional. In both tools, you can build hierarchies. You'll see it's much easier to do that in Tabular. Both tools, you can build some KPIs in there. Very simple. In both, actually, it's much easier. I think personally it's much easier in Tabular, but it's definitely not hard over in the multidimensional side either. Then there's a few things here that you may need. Write back is something that's much, much less commonly seen, but it may be a situation that you need. So write back, something that you can only do in multidimensional. Many-to-many relationships, role-playing dimensions, those two things, there are some workarounds in Tabular, excuse me, but it does not handle them natively. You have to go in and you have to write some DAX in order to be able to handle those two things. And then actions are something that's only available on the multidimensional side. All right, so real quick, I have just 2 or 3 slides here before we actually get into developing one of these models. And I want to talk to you guys about why we would build a data warehouse. So My preference for starting point for both of these is always a data warehouse, just because the data is generally much cleaner than going to your source systems. So a tool like Power Pivot is built to bring in tables on its own. So it's not built to require a data warehouse, but it definitely helps. Therefore, going from Power Pivot to Tabular, you kind of have the same situation. You don't have to build your tabular model off of a data warehouse, but I would highly recommend it just because it's generally got a good set of history. It's usually more of a single source of truth, and also the data tends to be much cleaner in those types of environments. So why even build a data warehouse? One, they're optimized for reporting. So inside of a regular transactional system, your customer table, for instance, might be broken out into 5 or 6 different tables. So you have a lot of joins to put together if you need to get data. Here inside of a warehouse, we have a single key that we can join back, and it has all of our customer information inside of it. So fewer joins means faster reporting more often than not. It's also a great way to archive data. So inside of our warehouse, we can keep history. So if we have a customer that changes their address, we can keep both versions of that customer record here. A lot of times, probably more often than not, you're not going to have that history maintained inside of your transactional systems. And then finally, consolidation of data. So we might have 5 or 6 different systems, maybe a system that keeps track of all of our customers, another system that keeps track of all of our sales, and another one that keeps track of all of our sales people and like HR kind of data. We want to bring that all together in one place, and a data warehouse is a perfect way to do that. Okay. So a couple of terms here that you're going to hear come up quite a bit. Dimensions, those are going to be the things that you see here pointed out on the pivot table. More often than not, they're the things that you're going to put on your rows and on your columns. So you can think of those kind of like your where clause. So show me all of my sales where the year was 2003 and the country was Australia and the accessories were bikes, or I was in the accessories category, the bikes category. So those are usually your where clause. Dimensions are generally wide tables. So I mentioned in a transactional system, you might have 5 or 6 different tables that make up your customer dimension. Inside of a data warehouse, you're going to combine those all into a single table. And then surrogate keys are a data warehousing way to be able to keep track of history. So you keep the source system key. Maybe the source system key is the customer's first and last initial, and then some letters behind it. And then inside of your dimension here, you would assign that a new surrogate key, and those are used for tracking historical records. If you guys have any other questions about these dimensions or fact terminology or anything that I'm talking about here, please feel free to put it in the chat, and if I don't get to it at the end here, I'd be more than happy to give you some resources and shoot you an email after the session about some of these, because these are kind of important things to be able to grasp in order to understand how analysis services works. Okay. And then finally, we have your fact table. So your fact tables are going to store your numbers, basically. So what item did I sell? And for that item, how much of it did I sell? What was the tax? What was the cost? Who sold it? All those kind of things. So your fact table is what actually stores your numbers. So in this case, in a sales fact table, it's how much did I sell? How many did I sell? Those kind of things. Your dimensions, again, are those slicers. Okay. So why even use analysis services? It's going to help us build faster reports, and it's going to help us build drag and drop reports. So faster reporting, analysis services goes out, it pulls in all the relevant data that it needs to build these models, and it already does it already kind of knows the intersection between all the different tables. So it has some pre-aggregations done on the multidimensional side, and on the analysis services tabular side, all that data is in memory, so it's very easy for it to be able to associate these different tables with each other. So it's a very, very fast reporting environment. It also allows you to do drag and drop reports. So I mentioned Excel earlier. Excel is probably the most commonly used reporting tool in the world, and it's all about drag and drop user interface there. Finally, centralized logic. It kind of goes back to the same point I made, excuse me, the same point I made over in the data warehouse side. If we want to put one version of the truth, analysis services and your data warehouse are really the places to do that. That way, when we go and we ask, well, what was the profit for Q1 of 2014? We're all saying the same number. Finance doesn't have their profit calculation. Sales doesn't have their profit calculation. The CEO doesn't have his own profit calculation. We're all talking the same language. We've all got centralized logic. All right, so first one we're going to take a look at here is going to be analysis services multidimensional. So these are kind of the steps that we're going to take. We're going to go out, we're going to create a data source. So we have to have a connection to get to our data, first of all. Then we're going to build a DSV, that stands for data source view. Essentially, that's the subset of my data source that my cube is allowed to consume. So if I don't want my cube to see a certain table, I don't bring it into my DSV. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that here in just a moment. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to run through the cube wizard. It's going to build us our first analysis services cube. It's going to be pretty terrible, but we're going to roll with it. Because the next thing we're going to do is go and extend it. So we're going to make those dimensions a little bit more usable, and then we're going to go in and we're going to enhance the cube. So do things like data types and create calculations, those kind of things. So that's kind of going to be our steps, our set of steps that we're going to do here for multidimensional. So we'll revisit this before we go into tabular, just to kind of show you guys a little bit of one versus the other. Okay, so let's go ahead and build ourselves an analysis services multidimensional cube. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hop over to my VM here, and we're going to use data tools. So I'm doing this all on SQL Server 2012, which 2012 got rid of the BIDS environment, the Business Intelligence Development Studio. So if you're on 2008 R2 or before, you'll actually be able to do these same exact things for the multidimensional side. You would just do it inside the BIDS environment. Okay? So we're here inside of data tools, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. So same processes that you would go through for pretty much all the Microsoft BI stack here. What you notice is if we go over here to analysis services, is that we actually have a couple of different options here that weren't there in previous versions. So what we can do, these top two are kind of the same as what was there before. They were renamed a little bit here. So the top one you'll see there is analysis services multidimensional and data mining project. So that's your typical multidimensional that we're going to look at. The second one here is one that we had in previous version as well. So we can actually import a multidimensional cube from the server. Keep in mind here when I say we're going to be able to import these from the server, if I want to do an import into a multidimensional project, I can only import from a multidimensional analysis services instance. I cannot point the import from server multidimensional to a tabular instance and still be able to pull all that data in. Okay. These last three options down here, we'll talk briefly about those when we go over to the tabular side. So for right now, I'm going to say analysis services, multidimensional, and data mining. I'm going to call my project here SSASMD, so SQL Server Analysis Services Multidimensional, and I'm going to leave it in just my projects folder there. So again, if you're looking at 2008 R2, this right here is going to be the same thing that you're going to see in 2008 R2. So the first thing that we need to do, the steps that I had in the slides there, you kind of notice that they go right down the list here from data source to data source view to building a cube to building out dimensions. So we're kind of going to follow the same path that they've given us here inside of the project. Ultimately, what we're going to do is get that built and then deploy it out to one of these two analysis services instances. So I mentioned early on that analysis services now has two types, multidimensional and tabular. You can have an instance of analysis services, but it has to be tied to a specific version of analysis services. So for instance, this is my default instance, or my unnamed instance here, just the MS SQL Server, and it's tied to the multidimensional. You'll notice the icon down here is a little bit different on the tabular one, but I can't have two analysis services. I can't have both analysis services multidimensional and analysis services tabular on the same instance. I have to have an instance can only be tied to one version of analysis services. So that's why I have the second instance over here called tabular. I've seen some places, some companies that will do this, and they'll make the default instance the tabular, and then they'll call the secondary instance MD or multidimensional or something like that. It's really personal preference how you actually go in there and set those up. So ultimately, though, we're going to build this cube, and we're going to deploy it out here into this instance of analysis services. Okay, so let's again just go down the list here. We're going to kind of zoom through some of these steps rather than going into too deep a detail on these. So I've already got my connection here to my AdventureWorks DW 2012 database. If you're coming in here for the first time, it's going to look just like this. You're going to come in, it's going to say that you don't have any data connections set up, and you're going to have to create a new connection. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that I want to go to my local host, and I mentioned that I prefer to pull all my data out of a data warehouse, so we're going to go with AdventureWorks DW 2012. Test my connection here real quick and click OK. So there's my AdventureWorks connection. I'll click Next. So this is going to be the credentials that are used to connect to the data source and actually pull the data out of the database. So I'm actually going to specify /administrator in my super secret password1 on my demo machines here. We'll say Next. And then we just have to give our data source a name. So we'll stick with AdventureWorks DW 2012. So when I click Finish, what you guys are going to notice is it's actually going to put a data source over here under the data source section. It's going to be called AdventureWorks DW 2012. So far, so good. Okay. Next thing we need to do is create our DSV. And this, again, is a little bit of a wizard base here. So we're going to create our DSV. We're going to say Next, get past the little welcome screen there. And then here's a list of all of our data sources that we have inside of our project. If I didn't have any data sources inside my project, what I could do is come down here and just click on New Data Source. And that would allow me to create a data source right here inside the DSV wizard. We've already got one created, so we'll go ahead and use the one that we've got. The next thing that we get here is a list of all the tables and all the views. You notice all the views are down here at the bottom. All the tables and all the views that we have inside of our database. So the left-hand side is all of our available objects to choose from, everything inside of our database. And the right side is everything that we want to have inside of our data source view. So what we're going to do is we're going to take Fact Internet Sales. We're just going to click the single chevron to move this over one. Or if we do the double, it's going to move everything over from the available objects. So only the one that we have selected is the one that we want to bring over. We'll hit the right arrow, and it moves over Fact Internet Sales. What you notice that we can do down here is we have this little option called Add Related Tables. This is a nifty little option because if we hit Add Related Tables, it's going to go and look at all my foreign keys between my fact table and all the other related tables, and it's going to pull in everything that's related one level deep. So there's a direct relationship from my Fact Internet Sales to my DIM Sales Territory table, as well as a direct relationship to currency and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this up just a little bit. So say we don't want some of these tables in here, we can actually remove them as well. I can either double click on them, or I can come over here and say, you know, I don't really need the currency table, so I'm just going to click the little left arrow here. Okay. And we'll go ahead and get rid of sales territory. We'll keep this small. Product, date, customer, and promotion. Okay? And then, of course, our fact table. So now we have all of our tables that we need. We're going to click Next. We're going to name our DSV. Again, you can name this anything that we want here. And we're going to click Finish. So this looks very much like a relational diagram that you'd have for a database. We can come in here, if we right-click on these fields, we can set the logical primary key since we actually pulled from tables, and there is primary keys and foreign keys already defined on the database. It already knows what the primary key is, but if you ever bring in a view, you can come over here and you can say Set Logical Primary Key on these. If you need to set multiple columns as a primary key, you can right-click on multiple columns and do that as well. One of the things that we're going to want to do in here, and keep this in mind because this is going to be a little bit different whenever we go into Tabular, is we want to be able to rename these tables to something a little bit easier for our users to understand. 9 times out of 10, or 9.5 times out of 10 maybe, your users are not going to know what a dimension or a fact table is. So we want to name these things that are more useful to them, more like internet sales or date instead of fact internet sales and dim date. So one of the properties that we have, if we click on one of these tables, the property that we have over here is called friendly name. And the friendly name is what's going to be displayed to our users. It's a good idea to go ahead and do this as early as possible because you're going to end up removing all these dims and facts from on your tables multiple times later on. If you remove them here at the very beginning, it's going to carry through the entire project, and you won't have to worry about going in and setting the names as many times later on down the road. Okay, so now we've got all of our friendly names cleaned up here. We've got all our relationships. If you ever come in here and one of these relationships is not in place, or maybe one of the relationships is wrong for some reason, you can come over here, you can right-click on this and say delete the relationship, and it'll just remove that relationship from the data source view here. If I ever need to bring that back, though, all I really have to do is take my product key, drag it, and drop it on product key. So from the foreign key table into the primary key table. If I do that backwards, what you notice happens here is I get a little screen that pops up and says a relationship is between a primary key and a non-primary key column. It will let you continue doing this, but you'll notice the primary key table is wrong. They're flip-flopped. It does give you the option here to just reverse it. So that's one of the nice things about Tabular, actually, is it's very good about that, and it will actually, no matter which way you drag that arrow in Tabular, it'll actually put the relationship properly based on the data that's in the tables. Okay. So now our DSV is done. Let's hop over and run our cube wizard. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say new cube. Again, lots of wizards here. We'll get into some actual development stuff here in just one moment. So we're going to say that we want to use existing tables to build this cube. We'll click next. And then we need to tell it which one of these are our measure group. So we're going to say internet sales, because that was our fact table. Keep in mind, fact table and measure group, the terms are interchangeable. You'll see measure group sprinkled throughout the analysis services world here. But fact and measure are the same. So fact table and measure group are the same thing. So internet sales is our measure group. We only have one. And then it wants to know which one of these are actually measures inside the measure group. So which one of these are actually the numbers that we want to aggregate up. So what you notice here is we get things like currency key and sales territory key, but we don't get product key or customer key inside of here. The reason for that is this is obviously a key value, so it's an integer, and it views that integer, and it sees that there's no relationship to another table inside the DSV, so it assumes that since it's an integer with no relationship on it, that it's actually a value that you want to aggregate, which obviously is not the case here, so we'll just come through and we'll uncheck these couple of key columns here. The last one that you'll notice down here at the very bottom gets added automatically, and that's going to be just a count of the records inside the table. So that one's going to be very important for doing things like averages, if you need to do a calculation and calculate an average. So I always keep that one in there, even though I may not use it right away. More often than not, you're going to need it at some point. The next thing it's going to do, it's going to come in here, it's going to suggest some dimensions. Notice that it's got all of our dimensions, but it also has internet sales down here. The reason why you're going to see internet sales in here is it's taken a look at the data, and if we go over here and we actually look at our internet sales table, it thinks that we may want to slice the internet sales by a field that's inside internet sales. So a key difference between Tabular and Multidimensional here is if I want to slice a fact table by data inside the fact table, I have to import that as both a fact and as a dimension. So the reason why we're getting that here is something like our sales order number. So if we want to go in and we want to see all the sales by sales order number, then we need to have that in our analysis services cube as a dimension in order to be able to slice the fact table by that. That's, again, a key difference between this and what we're going to do over in the tabular model here in just a moment. Okay? So sales order number is part of the reason why we're seeing that show up in here as a dimension. Okay? So we'll click on next. We'll go ahead and leave that one in there. A lot of times it'll suggest that even though you really don't need it there. If you don't need it, you can always come in here and like uncheck any of these, and it won't actually create the dimension inside of our project here. Okay, so there's our cube name. We're going to shorten this up a little bit. We're going to call this ADW AdventureWorks 2012. And then watch what happens over here again in my project. You're going to see a cube get created, and then each one of these dimensions. So you're going to see 5 dimensions get created over here all at the same time. So we're going to click Finish. There's my cube. There's all of my dimensions. And then we have a whole lot of stuff inside of here. We'll go through one of these sections here briefly, and then we'll get this deployed out. If you guys are interested in more details on some of these other pieces, we do have some other webinars that go a little bit more deep, a little bit deeper into analysis services multidimensional here. But obviously, with trying to cover some tabular in here as well, we're not going to have time to go into each one of these. I'll briefly tell you what some of them do, but the only one that we're really going to look at here is the dimension usage. This one's really important because it tells us how each one of our dimensions are related back to our fact table. What you see here is that all of these currently have a regular relationship with the exception of this very top one. So we have a regular relationship, meaning it's just an inner join, just a key column inner join between the two. That's going to be your most well-performing type of relationship inside of analysis services as well. The difference here, and you notice the icon that we have here is a little bit different. You'll notice that the relationship type is a fact-based relationship, and we don't have to tell it what column to do the join on. The reason for that is with a fact-based relationship, the granularity of your fact table is the same as the granularity of your measure group. So you don't have to define the columns that you join those two on, because there's a one-for-one relationship between the number of records inside of this measure group here and the number of records, corresponding records inside this internet sales over here. So the granularity of my measure group and my dimension are the same, and therefore I have a fact-based relationship there. Okay, so those are going to be, that's really the most important tab that we're going to cover today. Calculations, again, I mentioned you can go in here and do things like creating a calculation for profit, or you can say on certain years I want to make my goal higher than other years. If you have a goal value in there, you can maybe create a goal value if you want to take the previous year's sales and multiply it times, add an additional 10%, and that's your goal for this year. You do all kinds of things in there with calculations. KPIs are key performance indicators. It's where we're going to compare two values and give us a visual representation of whether or not we hit our goal or not. Actions, we can do all kinds of things in here, like going in and we can say if we trigger one of these actions, then it's going to launch a reporting services report or go to a particular URL. So something that we've done before and in previous cubes is we've taken some customer data, and whenever you build an action that will actually take the customer's address and pass it into a URL parameter for Bing Maps or Google Maps, and it will actually launch a web page that will show you where that customer's address is on the map whenever you go to the action. So a lot of different things that we can do in there. Partitions and aggregations, those two are both more performance tuning items. Perspectives are, you can think of those kind of like views on top of your analysis services cube. Translations are probably something that you're never going to use because they're semi-useless. I've never actually had a real reason to use translations. Essentially, you can go in and you can create additional translations and define different column names. It doesn't change the actual data. The only thing that you get inside the translations there is really the column names, and then finally a cube browser so you can go in and do a little bit of data manipulation and see how your cube is shaping up. Okay, so what we've done here is essentially we've created our data source, we created our data source view, told DSV again that's all the tables from our data source that we're allowed to look at inside of our analysis services project, and then we ran through the cube wizard. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and say I want to right click on the project and I want to process the whole project. And while this is running, what this is going to actually do is it's going to take this whole structure, which is really just XML in the background. It's going to take this whole structure, it's going to push it out to my database, which in this case is actually defined as localhost, and it's going to query each one of the tables and pull in all the data. So the reason that this step here is important is two things. One, if we make any changes to our project here, it has to push those changes out to the server. And the server is defined inside the project properties here under the deployment section. So that's where I tell it what server and database to send this to. Okay. So any data changes that happen, it's going to load those onto my server, and then also any structure changes that I've made here to my analysis services project, those are going to get pushed out there as well. A very key thing to remember here is that there's no data stored inside of my workspace here. I can right-click in here and I can actually tell it that I want to explore data, but this is going out and it's actually querying the data right now. No data is actually stored here on my computer locally in order to do this project. And that's going to be a very key difference between what you see here and what you're going to see in just a moment over in the tabular side of things. Okay, so right-click here, say process. That's going to build and deploy all of the structure and then also move all of the data into our analysis services cube. So where that just got put was inside this multidimensional version of analysis services. So if I refresh this database here, if I say refresh, there's my SSAS MD that we just got done creating. So now we're ready to browse this. So now we've got our cube built. We're ready to give our users the opportunity to take a look at the data inside of there and give us some feedback, which I can tell you is probably going to be pretty poor right out the gate here. So the way that we're going to connect to this, we're going to come up here and do data. We're going to say from other sources, analysis services. I'm going to go to my local host. I'm going to go find my analysis services MD that we just created. You can see the modified time there, 11:37 a.m. We're going to click next, and then I'm going to just say finish. So I want to just do a pivot table here just to show you guys what we have going on. So here's all those measures. So all the columns that we said that we checked off on that measure group section. These are all of those here, in addition, including that count. Where's my internet sales count here? So if I check off any of these, you'll notice that they go down here into my values section. Okay? The thing that's pretty poor about this out of the gate is that there's no formatting. So sales amount, we know looking at that and seeing sales amount that needs to actually be a dollar value. Also, if we come down here and we have customer key, but we don't actually have any values for our customer. It's all just the key values. Those really don't mean anything to anybody. So let's go and we'll just take our customer dimension and we'll actually create ourselves a little bit better environment here to work with. So back over in our project, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to first of all fix my customer dimension. So all I have in here currently is my key value. If I want to add something like the first name or last name, any of these other fields here, maybe I'm curious as to whether men or women buy more of my products, so I can just drag over gender. Or maybe I'm curious about whether married or single people buy more of my product. I can drag over something like marital status. If I don't want my users to see one of these columns, I either don't add them from the DSV, or if it's over here on the left-hand side and I need the value, so I always have to have a key. But if I don't want my users to see this value, what I can do is right-click and go to Properties, and then I have a property in here called Attribute Hierarchy Visible. All I have to do is switch that to false, and it's no longer going to show up in my pivot table list. So I'm going to go ahead and process this and get this deployed out. So I'm going to process my changes and come over here and refresh. Oh, let me reprocess my cube. Sorry about that. We'll just do the whole thing here. So we'll get this processed. So again, it's deploying my changes, the structure changes that I made to my dimension here, as well as updating the data inside of there. So if I hit refresh now, what you notice is once this gets done, if I take my customer key out, if I come over to customer, I no longer see customer key inside of my customer table. All I see is the gender and the marital status. So I can do this here, and I can see at a quick glance that it looks like men just barely out-ordered women, but women on average probably spent more money because the sales amount was higher with a lower sales quantity. We can do the same thing over here with marital status, and we can see that married people outspent single people, but that's not too much of a difference, so I would imagine that the average sale between those two actually was higher for single people than married people. So really easy to go in there and extend the usability of this dimension. But we also need to extend the usability of these measures up here. So we want to be able to change the formatting. So I'm going to zoom through this, and then we're going to hop over to our tabular model because I do want to get that in before we wrap up here. Okay. So if I need to change the formatting of any of this, like my sales amount, I right-click on here and go to Properties, and then I have an option here called Format String, and I'm just going to choose. Okay. Again, I've made a change, so I need to reprocess. So I've made some changes. We're going to do a reprocess here. I'm just going to do a default since it doesn't need to re-pull all that data just to change the formatting on it. And then when I come over here and I refresh again, now my sales amount has been formatted a little bit differently. So you can see there's actually there's a lot of work having to go back and forth here. So we actually have to format all of these different columns here individually. It doesn't pull the data types from my data and make intelligent decisions as to what the formatting of that should be. If I want to come in here and I want to create hierarchies, we then have to get into something called attribute relationships and tell the system how my gender is related to my customer key, or if we're over on our date dimension, we have to tell it how a year is related to a quarter, how a quarter is related to a month. So in order to set up hierarchies, you can do it very quickly, but in order to get them to perform well, we have to get into something a little bit more deep than what we're going to have time to do today in your attribute relationships. So if we wanted to fully build out this cube that we're looking at right here and make it 100% usable, get all the columns in here that we wanted, format all this stuff, it would probably take us a little over, maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to come in here and do all this. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to rebuild this whole thing, but over inside of the tabular model, and you'll see how much quicker, because one of the things I mentioned earlier was that design time is much lower for a tabular model. So we'll see how much faster it is to actually build this in the tabular model. So again, our steps here, you can see, very similar to our multidimensional. We need a data source, we needed a DSV, and then we had to do some other work. We're going to do something similar over here in tabular, and then we're going to create a data source, we're going to import tables, and then we're going to define calculations. So a smaller set of tasks that we have to do over here on the tabular side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, I'm going to create ourselves a new project. I'll say new project. And this time, we're going to look at the Analysis Services Tabular project. Again, we can import from the server, or those of you out there who have gotten started with Tabular a little bit and maybe didn't even know it, if you've used Power Pivot before and you have a Power Pivot model, you can actually upsize just through a wizard, through a couple of clicks, you can actually upsize a Power Pivot workbook and make it into a full-size tabular project with just going through a little wizard. So we're going to create a new one here, though. We're going to call this one SSAST for tabular. We're going to say OK. And then we're going to tell it local workspace. We have to have a place for, define a workspace for it to deploy some of the structure and to house some of the data, because again, there's a little bit of a difference between the way that the design time works here between these two products. So we have to have some place for it to be able to store this data as we're building the model. So that's what our workspace server there is going to do for us. So click OK. Much different interface here, but if you're inside of Excel, this is going to be a little bit more comfortable for you because you've already seen some of this stuff. So again, we're going to build essentially the same project that we built over in Multidimensional, but we're going to do it much, much quicker, and it's going to be much more usable right out from the beginning. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to come up here, and instead of right-clicking over here on the left-hand or on the right-hand side and saying that we want to create a new data source and then creating a data source view, all we have to do is come up here to the top with Tabular and say import from data source. We're going to do the same thing as we did before again from SQL Server. We're going to choose our local host, and then I want my AdventureWorks DW 2012. Okay. Again, what credentials do I want to use to access the data? My administrator account, password, and then now, before that was the end of our wizard. We set up the data source, and then we came in and we created a data source view. Inside Tabular, those two steps are kind of combined together. We tell it we have a data source, and then we tell it which tables from that data source we want to import. So we'll tell it that we want to do this from a list of tables, or you have the option to actually write a query inside of here as well. So if you need names or anything like that, this is where the power of being able to go directly to some of your source systems may be a little bit better inside of Tabular. So you do have the option to come in here and specify queries instead. You can go in and create inside of Multidimensional as well. It's just a little bit easier to do that, I think, here inside of Tabular. Very similar type of situation. Instead of like we had over in Multidimensional where we went from the left side over to the right side, here we just need to go through and do a checkbox. So I'm going to go find my Fact Internet Sales, and again, I'm going to say select related tables. So same tables got selected here. We're going to go through and remove a couple of them. So I think we got rid of sales territory before. We got rid of dim currency before. So we're left with just a couple of tables here. So the next step that we did was set the friendly names. If you guys remember before, we had to right-click on them, and we had to say set friendly name. Here we get a column, and we can go ahead and do that right off the bat. I'll show you what happens if we don't set a column here. I'll show you another way to change this here in just one second. So I'm going to leave my fact tables as Fact Internet Sales, and I'll show you how to change that over to just Internet Sales. If you want to preview the data, we've got some options here to preview the data. We can also filter data out, so if you only want to bring in data for a particular time period, you can go in and do that, or a particular sales territory. The one thing to keep in mind here, though, is if I go and I say that I only want to bring in promotion number 1 with no discount, I have to also do that filter on my fact table. So if I come in here and I only want promotion number 1, this filtering here only affects this table. It will not affect the data that comes in on my fact table. So I'll end up missing some data where I go to slice my data set here. So keep that in mind. Filtering a dimension does not, filtering a table here does not filter other tables. It only applies a filter to this one individual table. Okay? So we'll click on Finish here. And then this is where I mentioned a very key difference. So if you guys remember before, when we were in Multidimensional, all we had at this point was a list of tables. We had our data source view. Here, we're importing the data, and you can see as it goes through here, it's actually importing the data from all these tables. And when I click Close here, what you see come up in the background is all that data that all those tables I just told it to bring in. It's actually storing all that data here on my computer. So it's very key whenever you're doing development inside Tabular to start a data set. I like to go in views to only maybe give me 1 month, or maybe the first 10 records from each month or something like that, so I get a little bit smaller data set here. But what we see is that we have all of our tables here, and all these tables already have all of our data inside them. So we can actually see the data that we're working with. If I do want to rename these tables, maybe I forgot to rename, or maybe my users come back and they say they want a different name, all I have to do is come down here and right-click and say Rename. This is the equivalent of that friendly name option before on the previous screen that we were looking at. Okay, so this is a very closely related to how Excel looks. You know, we have tabs down here at the bottom that represent each one of our tables. If I want to see relationships between my tables, or all I have to do is come over here to the diagram. And while I'm on the diagram view, once this comes up here in just a second, you'll see there's all my relationships between all my tables. So this looks very much like DSV did. So it's very similar in that respect. These multiple lines that you see here, this is one of the things that I mentioned Tabular does not do well, is role-playing dimensions. You can actually only have one active relationship between 2 tables at a time. And if I hover over this, you'll see it's actually my OR date key is the active relationship. So the dotted lines means that there's a relationship there, but it's an inactive relationship. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, again, if you want to see what this is going to be deployed to, it's going to go to my localhost Tabular into my database SSAST. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click here I'm going to deploy this one similar to the way that I did the process option there inside of multidimensional. Same thing is going to happen. So every time I do a deploy here, and this is one of the downsides of the tabular, is that every time I do a deploy, it's going to completely rebuild all these tables. So it has to rebuild every one of these tables every single time. So what that just did for us, though, much like whenever I right-clicked and did the process or did the deploy in Tabular, actually in Multidimensional, it just moved that database out here, that SAST database, out to my Tabular instance. And what we can do now is come over here, same exact way we did this with Multidimensional, go to Data, say that I want to pull in data from analysis services, tell it that I want to go to localhost, this time /tabular, because again I need to go to my tabular instance. I'll click Next. I'll go find the appropriate database. That database there, that's the working database. So if you guys remember there, I had to define a workspace server. That's the workspace model that it put out there to help me build this. So I want the actual SSAST, and it's called model. We'll click Next and Finish. And two things right off the bat that you notice here. One is that I have a way more usable customer dimension. It actually brought in every single one of those columns that I had. I have to go in and add new columns into my data model here. All of these columns are already in here. So there's my male and my female. Scroll down here a little bit more. There's my marital status. So all these options, all my options are already very, very usable. I don't have to do any work on those. The one thing that you will notice, though, is that I have no measure fields defined. This is a big difference between these two tools, or these two versions of analysis services. Multidimensional automatically defines measures. Analysis services Tabular, on the other hand, does not explicitly or does not implicitly define measures for you. You actually have to go in and define all the measures. On the flip side of that, Multidimensional does not automatically define attributes inside of each one of your tables. Here inside Tabular, obviously, it already defined each one of these attributes for me. So it's already done that automatically. So let's talk about how to fix both of these situations. So first situation, we need to get some values up here. So what we're going to do is hop over here into my model. And I have this other section, if you guys notice down here at the very bottom. I have two sections. All my data is at the top, and then this bottom section down here is where I build all my calculations. I'm going to show you a real quick way to build a calculation here. And if you guys are interested in this a little bit more, we have a few webinars out there on DAX and a little bit more in-depth talking about the tabular model here, build some more complex, to build these calculations here. So I'm going to show you the quick and easy way to do this. So if I wanted to get the most common type of calculation is to sum a particular column. So I want the sum total of all my sales amount, or I want the sum total of all my product costs. What I can do here is I can click down here in this bottom section right underneath my sales amount column. I can just hit this auto sum button. And what that's going to do is it's going to automatically write a DAX calculation for me using DAX, and it's going to sum the sales amount field. If I want to do that on many fields all at once, I can actually come over here and I can select multiple fields and then hit the auto sum button. And because I'm below each one of those fields, you're going to see it's actually going to create a calculation for every single one of those. Get rid of that one there. So what I've just done is I've actually created essentially the same thing that we did inside of our analysis services cube by default whenever we checked off the boxes and told it which one of these were measures, is come over here, tell it which columns I want to create the sum for, and then hit the auto sum button. I can also do average, count, distinct count, min, and max in here if I'd like as well. So that's the easiest way to come in here and create these calculations. Again, just like in Analysis Services Multidimensional, we make a change, we need to do a deploy. So I'm going to right-click on here and say deploy. If you guys remember, what's going to happen here is it's actually going to go in, it's going to pull all the data back into the model one more time. And now I can come over here and say refresh, and there's all my sums. So sum of my sales amount, and look at that, it's already formatted the way that I wanted it to be. So there we can see which male or female who bought the most product from me. If I need to change, if it implicitly figured out that this was a currency but it actually needs to be a decimal, I can come into here and change that as well. With one of my columns selected, all I have to do is go to my properties. If I open up my properties tab here, and there you see the date form, or the data type format here. So I can actually change this from a currency to a whole number or a decimal or percentage, any of these different types here. So I can actually change the formatting on this if it guessed this incorrectly. So you'll see that a lot of the things that I mentioned we had to do over there in the analysis services multidimensional side of things, the tabular model here has actually done a lot of those for us. It's very easy, obviously all these columns are already included inside of our data set. But if I don't want one of those columns, again inside multidimensional, I just either right-clicked on it and said hide the attribute hierarchy, or I just didn't put it over onto that left-hand column. If I want to hide one of these, like name style, that probably doesn't mean anything to a user. They don't care what the style of the name is in the database. They just need to know the name. So if I don't want them to see this, all I have to do is right-click and use this Hide from Client Tools option. Okay, so I'm going to hide that. You'll notice the column is going to turn gray there. And then so we'll hop over here to Excel to show you where that field is. So, oops, if I can scroll down here. So there's that name style field. Once I do a redeploy though, so I'm going to do a deploy. It's going to go out again, it's going to pull all that data, and it's going to rebuild my tabular model. And then when I come back over to Excel and I refresh, notice name style just went away. So it's very easy to be able to hide these different fields compared to the work that we have to go to potentially inside of multidimensional. So what you see here, though, we spent much less time doing this little wizard here to build this tabular model compared to all the time that we spent over here on the multidimensional model. And the tabular model is arguably out the gate much, much more usable than the multidimensional. So this goes back to the slide that we were looking at a little bit earlier, where I was mentioning that scalability, yeah, you definitely have scalability on your side there with multidimensional. But the development time, as you guys just saw here, even just during doing a simple model here during the webinar, development time was definitely on the side of tabular, much more usable in a much smaller amount of time. Okay, so that's really all the time. Hopefully you guys get a little bit of an idea as to what you can do with those two different products there. Again, we do have some other more in-depth webinars on each one of those separately because they are both very large topics to talk about. But I definitely just want to give you guys an idea of some of the pros and cons of each of those as far as getting started with those. Ultimately, both tools you saw, you can pop open Excel and hop in there and just do some drag and drop reporting. Very, very useful for all your users to be able to do stuff like that. But ultimately, the development time is going to be much lower on the analysis services tabular side. Right. So again, if you guys do have any questions or anything, feel free to email me there. I know we have a few questions here in the chat box, and I'll try to get to one or two of those here before we wrap up in the last minute here, if that's okay with you, Rachel. I know we got 2 minutes left here.
We do have 2 minutes left, so feel free to answer questions like a pro.
So I got a question here from Kevin. It says, how well does SSAS interact with Microsoft PDW? So that's a great question actually for the client I'm working with right now. We're actually doing analysis services multidimensional on top of PDW, and it's working great. I actually have my measure groups are all using rollout mode, so we're actually doing real-time queries off of the PDW right now, and it's working perfect. The disadvantage of doing, there are some things that don't work necessarily 100% with that. If you have specific questions on that, Kevin, though, please shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to get with you and give you some of my thoughts on my experience with working with PDW and SSAS, because there's definitely some really awesome stuff in there, and definitely some things that don't work the way that you would think that they would. So I can definitely give you some of my experience there and tell you some of the things that haven't worked well for me. So we have a question here from Vince that says, are the relationships used for the related table options come from the database diagrams or the database? For the database. So the relationships, whenever we hit that find related, excuse me, that find related tables button, there, Vince, that's all using foreign key, primary key relationships that you have built into your database. So you do have to have those constraints built between the fields in order for it to pick those up. If you just define a primary key on all your tables, but you don't actually put the constraints in there, it's not going to be able to figure those out. So you do have to have the primary key, foreign key constraints built into your database. Okay. Another question here says from Rashid, can we use two fact tables in a single cube? Absolutely. So just in our quick example that we had here, we only had the one measure group in there, but you can add as many measure groups. I'm not aware of any limitation on the number of measure groups or fact tables that you can add into your cube at a time. Again, just for simplicity there, we only did the one, but if you ever want to do anything like a many-to-many relationship, then you actually are required to have additional measure groups or additional facts there inside of your cube. So absolutely you can add multiple measure groups or multiple fact tables in there as well.